A man adopts the most unloved dog from the shelter thinking he's just giving an unwanted animal a second chance, but weeks later his phone rings and what he hears on the other end changes everything. This dog isn't just any stray. It has a past that no one could have imagined. Why was this dog abandoned, and what shocking secret is about to be uncovered? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Ben Harper slumped in his creaky desk chair, his fingers hovering motionless over the keyboard. The harsh glow of his laptop screen illuminated yet another rejection email, the polite but crushing words blurring together. Unfortunately, your manuscript doesn't meet our current needs. He pushed back from the desk, running his hands through his disheveled dark hair. Around him, his small apartment told a story of his failures. Scattered papers covered every surface, red-marked bills peeked out from beneath draft manuscripts, and a collection of empty coffee cups formed a sad cityscape on his desk. The morning light filtering through dusty blinds cast shadows across years of rejected stories and broken dreams. What am I even doing? He muttered, crumpling up another marked-up draft and tossing it toward an already overflowing waste basket. It missed, joining dozens of other paper balls on the floor. The walls of his apartment seemed to close in around him. He needed air. Grabbing his worn jacket from the back of his chair, Ben hurried out the door, not bothering to lock it behind him. Who would want to steal rejection letters anyway? The city streets were busy with the usual morning crowd, people with purpose, people with destinations. Ben walked against the flow, hands stuffed in his pockets, no destination in mind. Each step took him further from his failures, but the weight in his chest remained after what felt like hours of wandering. A colorful banner caught his eye, flapping in the autumn breeze. Pet Adoption Day, find your forever friend. The banner hung above a modest storefront, its windows filled with hopeful signs and photos of animals. Ben paused, surprised to find himself in front of the city shelter. The cheerful yips and barks from inside offered a stark contrast to the silence of his apartment. Without really knowing why, he pushed open the door. The shelter was alive with energy. Dogs of all sizes bounced in their kennels, towels wagging as volunteers, LED potential adopters pee. The air was filled with excited barking and the sound of paws scratching against concrete floors. But in the corner, away from the chaos, sat a different kind of dog, an older German shepherd, gray around the muzzle, watched the scene with quiet dignity. Unlike the other dogs, she made no attempt to gain attention, no desperate pleas for notice. She simply observed, OBD, her intelligent brown eyes taking everything in. Something about her stillness drew Ben closer. The nameplate on her kennel read Rosie. Hey there, he said softly, kneeling in front of her enclosure. The dog's ears perked slightly, but she remained calm, studying him with what almost looked like understanding. Then slowly, deliberately, Rosie moved closer to the kennel door. She lifted her PW with gentle grace and placed it on Ben's knee. Through the bars, the simple gesture, so careful and intentional, sent an unexpected wave of emotion through him. In her calm gaze he saw something he couldn't explain, a wisdom, a knowing that seemed to look right through his carefully constructed walls. For the first time that day, maybe for the first time in months, the crushing weight of failure lifted slightly, just enough to let him breathe. Lisa, the shelter worker, approached Ben as he knelt by Rosie's kennel. Her face held a mix of concern and something else, hope maybe, though she tried to hide it behind professional caution. I should warn you about her, Lisa said, gesturing toward Rosie. She's been returned twice already. She crossed her arms, her name Tag catching the fluorescent light. She's old, stubborn, and not exactly the easiest dog to care for. Most people want puppies or younger dogs, but Ben couldn't look away from those intelligent brown eyes. Rosie hadn't moved her paw from his knee, maintaining that gentle but deliberate contact. There was something different about her, something he couldn't explain. The adoption paperwork took less time than he expected. Before he knew it, Ben was leading Rosie up the stairs to his apartment, her steps slow but steady. Beside him he'd bought the basics: food, water bowls, and a plush dog bed that cost more than he probably should have spent. Inside, Rosie made a careful inspection of the apartment, her nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors. Ben cleared a space near his desk for the dog bed, arranging it just so. "Here you go, girl, your new spot." Rosie looked at the bed head, then at Ben, then deliberately walked past it. Instead, she settled herself right beside his desk chair, curling up on the hard floor with a quiet sigh. Hours passed. The food bowl remained untouched. No barks, no whines, just that watchful silence. Ben found himself glancing at her more and more frequently, worry creeping in. Most dogs he knew were energetic, vocal. Rosie barely made a sound. "Maybe you were right," he muttered, thinking of Lisa's warning. Maybe this was a mistake. Later that night, Ben sat at his desk staring at his laptop screen. The cursor blinked mockingly at the end of a half-finished sentence. He'd been stuck on this chapter for days, and the words refused to come. With a groan of frustration, he pushed back from the desk, ready to give up for the night. But then he felt it, a gentle nudge against his hand. Rosie had raised her head, pressing her nose against his fingers. When he stopped typing, she nudged him again, more insistently. This time Ben couldn't help but chuckle. "What, you're a literary critic now?" Rosie just looked at him with those knowing eyes, her nose still pressed against his hand, as if trying to push it back toward the keyboard. All right, he sighed, reaching down to rub her head. Her fur was soft under his fingers, and she leaned into his touch slightly. "I'll keep going." Turning back to his laptop, Ben began to type again, aware of Rosie's quiet presence beside him, keeping watch. In the late night silence, the morning sun filtered through Ben's bedroom window, casting warm patches of light across the floor. As he blinked awake, he found Rosie sitting beside his bed, her eyes fixed on him with that same steady gaze from the shelter. The expensive dog bed in the corner remained pristine and unused, just like the tennis balls and chew toys he'd bought. "Morning, girl," he mumbled, running a hand through his messy hair. Rosie's tail thumped once against the floor, her version of a greeting. Over the next few days, a rhythm developed between them. Rosie shadowed Ben throughout the apartment, her paws making soft clicking sounds on the hardwood floors. She wasn't clingy or demanding. She simply existed alongside him, a quiet guardian who seemed to understand something he didn't. During his writing sessions, she proved herself to be quite the taskmaster. Whenever Ben's fingers stopped moving across the keyboard, a cold nose would press against his arm if he spent too long scrolling through social media. Instead of working on his manuscript, a gentle paw would tap his leg. It was almost uncanny how she sensed his creative blocks. One afternoon, when he'd been staring at the same paragraph for 20 minutes, Rosie let out a soft whine, the first sound he'd heard from her since bringing her home. She nudged his elbow repeatedly until he started typing again. "How do you always know?" he asked her once, but she just tilted her head, those intelligent eyes seeming to say, "Keep writing." That evening, after checking his email for the 5th time, Ben's heart sank. 3 more rejection letters waited in his inbox. Each one felt like another brick added to the weight he carried. Words like "not the right fit" and "best of luck" with your future endeavors blurred together on the screen. With a heavy sigh, he slid down to sit on the floor beside Rosie, who had maintained her usual spot next to his desk. The hardwood was cold beneath him, but he barely noticed she watched him, her expression somehow both concerned and patient. You don't give up on me, do you? He muttered in response. Rosie shifted closer, resting her head on his lap. The simple gesture carried more comfort than any words could have offered. The late morning sun streamed through Ben's apartment windows as he sat at his desk trying to work through a particularly difficult chapter. Rosie lay in her usual spot beside him, her chin resting on her paws. The quiet of their morning routine was broken by the sharp ring of his phone. Ben glanced at the unfamiliar number on the screen. Usually he let unknown calls go to voicemail, but something made him answer. Hello, is this Ben Harper? A woman's voice came through, polite but carrying an undercurrent of urgency that made him sit up straighter. Yes, this is Ben. My name is Evelyn Langley. I understand you recently adopted a German shepherd named Rosie. Ben's eyes dropped to Rosie, who had lifted her head at the sound of her name. That's right. Is something wrong? No, not wrong exactly. Evelyn paused. You see, Rosie belonged to my grandmother. She disappeared from our estate several months ago. Oh, Ben's stomach tightened. I'm sorry, I had no idea. The shelter said. The shelter? Evelyn's laugh was soft, almost sad. Of course she ended up there. Listen, Mr. Harper, my grandmother was Margaret Langley. The name hit Ben like a physical force. His hand gripped the phone tighter. Margaret Langley, the author? Yes. There was another pause. I know this must sound strange, but before she passed away, my grandmother used to say something that never made sense. Until now. She would look at Rosie and tell us Rosie will choose the right person. Ben's gaze met Rosie's steady brown eyes. The dog hadn't moved, but there was something in her expression, that same knowing look she'd had since the first day at the shelter. His mind spun with questions. Margaret Langley had been one of the most celebrated authors of her generation. Her books had inspired him to start writing in the first place. I don't understand, he managed to say. What did she mean by that? That's what I'd like to discuss with you, Evelyn replied. Would you be willing to meet? There's something you need to see. Ben stared at Rosie, who watched him with those calm, intelligent eyes, the same eyes that had drawn him in at the shelter, that had watched over him as he wrote, that seemed to understand every moment of doubt and frustration. What exactly had he stumbled into? Ben sat at his computer that evening, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Rosie lay at his feet, her warmth as steady comfort against his leg. After agreeing to meet Evelyn the next day, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger than him was unfolding. He typed Margaret Langley into the search bar. Pages of results filled his screen. Photos showed an elegant woman with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. Articles praised her masterful storytelling, her complex characters, her ability to weave hope through even the darkest narratives. Her books had won countless awards, touched millions of lives, but it was the recent headlines that caught his attention. Beloved author Margaret Langley passes at 76. Literary world mourns the loss of a legend. Margaret Langley's final novel remains unfinished. Ben clicked through the articles, learning about her last years spent in relative seclusion, working on what she claimed would be her most important work. The next morning, Ben's old car crunched up a gravel driveway lined with overgrown hedges. The Langley estate rose before him, a Victorian house that might once have been grand but now showed signs of neglect. Paint peeled from the window frames and vines crept up the walls. Unchecked. Rosie sat up straighter in the Passenger seat, her ears perked forward. It was the most alert he'd seen her since the adoption. A woman stood waiting on the front porch. Evelyn Langley had her grandmother's sharp eyes, though her dark hair showed no trace of silver. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a sweater, but carried herself with unmistakable grace. "Thank you for coming," she said as Ben approached Rosie, walking calmly beside him. Her gaze lingered on the dog, watching for some sign of recognition. But Rosie maintained her usual quiet demeanor. They settled in a sunny kitchen. With coffee, Rosie lay between them, her head on her paws, those intelligent eyes moving between their faces as they spoke. "My grandmother wasn't always the easiest person to understand," Evelyn began, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. "But in her final years, Rosie became special to her. More than just a pet." She would spend hours in her study reading her work aloud to Rosie, like she was testing the words on the most important critic she knew. Ben nodded, remembering how Rosie watched him write, how she seemed to know exactly when he needed encouragement. "The thing is," Evelyn continued, "grandmother kept saying Rosie would find the right person. We thought it was just, well, you know how people get as they age, but she was so certain." She stood suddenly, as if making up her mind about something. "There's something you need to see." Ben followed her through the house, up a narrow staircase and into what must have been Margaret's study. The room smelled of old paper and dust. Manuscripts filled every surface, stacked on the desk, spread across the floor, piled on chairs. Some were typed, others handwritten in a flowing script that covered page after page. In the center of the desk lay a thick stack of papers, the top sheet bearing a title in that same elegant handwriting. Evelyn picked it up carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. "This was her last work," she said softly, "the one she never finished." Ben's hands trembled as he lifted the manuscript. The paper felt delicate, almost sacred beneath his fingers. Rosie pressed closer to his leg as he began to read the first page. His breath caught in his throat. The words hit him like a physical blow. The rejection letter glowed on his computer screen, another reminder of his failures. Outside his window, the city moved on, indifferent to his dreams crumbling. That's when the dog came into his life, an old German shepherd nobody wanted, with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. Ben looked down at Rosie, then back at the pages. His heart pounded against his ribs. The protagonist's tiny apartment, the endless rejection letters, the late night writing sessions, every detail matched his life with unsettling precision. This can't be right," he whispered, his voice rough. "When did she write this?" Evelyn leaned forward, her brow furrowed. 3 years ago. She worked on it until the very end. "But that's impossible." Ben flipped through more pages, his hands shaking harder. "Look at this." The phone call from a stranger about the dog's past that just happened to me yesterday when you called. He read further, his coffee growing cold, and forgotten. The story described a journey of discovery where the protagonist began uncovering long buried family secrets through his connection with a dog. Each revelation seemed to push him toward some greater purpose, just as Rosie had been quietly guiding Ben since the day they met. "There's no way she could have known," Ben said, looking up at Evelyn. "These details, they're too specific. The way the dog nudges the main character to keep writing, how she watches him work." His voice trailed off as Rosie bumped his hand with her nose, as if on cue. Evelyn's expression softened. "Grandmother always said she didn't write her stories, she just wrote down what was already there waiting to be told." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather journal, its edges soft from years of handling. With gentle reverence, she placed it on the table between them. "Maybe this will give you answers," he said. Softly Ben stared at the journal, his heart racing. A chill crept up his spine as he realized that somehow years before they'd ever met, Margaret Langley had written his story, their story, and now, through Rosie, she was reaching out from beyond to guide him toward something he couldn't yet understand. Back in his dimly lit apartment, Ben sat cross-legged on his worn couch, the leather journal resting heavy in his lap. Rosie settled beside him, her warm presence steady and comforting. The spine of the journal crackled softly as he opened it, revealing Margaret's elegant handwriting flowing across the yellowed pages. The first few entries detailed her writing process, her thoughts about character development and plot structures. But as Ben turned the pages, the tone shifted. Personal memories began to emerge, woven between the literary notes. Her writing became more intimate, more raw. Today would have been Daniel's birthday. One entry read, 35 years old. Where are you, my boy? Do you ever read my books anymore? Ben's hands grew damp as he read. On Margaret wrote about her son Daniel's early passion for writing, how he'd spend hours crafting stories in his room, but something had changed. Self-doubt had crept in, poisoning his confidence. He'd struggled with the pressure of being Margaret Langley's son, feeling he could never measure up. Daniel left today, another entry stated, the ink slightly smudged as if tears had fallen on the page. He said he couldn't do it anymore, couldn't bear the weight of expectations. I should have seen it coming, should have told him his words were enough, that he was enough. Ben's throat tightened as he read about Margaret's desperate attempts to find her son. She had hidden messages in her books, hoping Daniel would recognize them, little details only he would understand, references to childhood memories, inside jokes they'd shared. I put another message in my latest novel, she wrote. Page 147, the scene with the blue kite. Remember when yours got stuck in Mrs. Peterson's oak tree? You were so determined to get it back. Where did that determination go, my son? His hands trembled as he turned to a more recent entry. The writing was shakier, but the words were clear. If he ever comes back, Rosie will know she remembers him. She was his before she was mine. Ben's heart thundered in his chest. He set the journal down, his mind spinning. His father, the man who'd abandoned him and his mother when Ben was just a baby, was named Daniel, a failed writer who disappeared without a trace. Could it be? Could Margaret Langley's lost son be his father? Rosie whined softly, pressing her nose against his hand. Ben looked down at her, seeing those knowing eyes in a new light. She'd belonged to Daniel first, to his father. The room seemed to tilt around him as the pieces clicked into place. Margaret Langley wasn't just a famous author whose dog he'd somehow adopted. She might be his grandmother. Ben's chest tightened with the weight of this revelation. He picked up the journal again, staring at Margaret's words until they blurred before his eyes. All those hidden messages in her books, they hadn't just been for Daniel. They'd been for him too, though neither of them had known it. Ben spent the night at his desk, paper scattered everywhere under the harsh glow of his lamp. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, but he couldn't stop searching. In an old manila envelope he found what he was looking for, a creased photograph of his father from before he'd left. The edges were worn soft from years of handling, the colors faded to sepia tones. His hands shaking, Ben pulled up the newspaper article about Margaret Langley on his laptop. There she was, decades younger, standing proudly at a book signing. The same high cheekbones, the same slight tilt of the head, the same thoughtful eyes. Ben held the photograph next to the screen, his breath catching. The resemblance was striking, the shape of their faces, the way they both had that slight furrow between their brows. When morning finally came, Ben picked up his phone and dialed Evelyn's number. Rosie sat at his feet watching him with those steady eyes as he waited. Through 3 rings. I think your grandmother was my father's mother, he said as soon as Evelyn answered, the words tumbling out before he could lose his nerve. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. He could hear Evelyn's soft breathing on the other end of the line. That would make us family, she finally whispered, her voice thick with emotion. They spent the next hour piecing together the timeline, filling in the gaps of their shared history. Daniel had left Margaret's home in his early 20s, cutting all ties with his past. He'd started fresh somewhere else, eventually meeting Ben's mother, only to repeat the pattern and disappear again. Rosie was his dog originally, Evelyn explained, her voice gentle. He got her as a puppy, but when he left her behind too. She became grandmother's constant companion. After that, Ben looked down at Rosie, who had rested her head on his knee all those years. Margaret had kept hoping Daniel would come back. She'd written messages in her books, kept his old room intact, and held on to his dog, maintaining these threads of connection, hoping one would eventually lead him home. Grandmother never gave up, Evelyn said. Even in her final days, she believed Rosie would somehow make things right. Ben ran his fingers through Rosie's soft fur, feeling the steady thump of her tail against the floor. For the first time since he could remember, the constant feeling of being adrift, of not belonging anywhere, began to fade. Here was his history, his family, all because an old dog in a shelter had chosen him. But as the pieces fell into place, one question remained growing larger in his mind. What had happened to his father? Where was Daniel? Now Ben sat in his apartment, the only light coming from a small desk lamp that cast long shadows across the room. His discovery about Margaret Langley being his grandmother should have brought clarity, but instead it only led to more questions. The biggest one haunted him. Where was his father? Now Rosie lay at his feet as Ben stared at his phone, his mother's number displayed on the screen. He hadn't called her in months, maybe longer. Their conversations had grown shorter over the years, both of them dancing around the subject that had always stood between them. His thumb hovered over the call button. Taking a deep breath, he pressed it. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Hello. His mother's voice was exactly as he remembered it, soft, careful, like someone used to cushioning hard truths. Mom, I need to ask you something. Ben's voice cracked slightly. About Dad? The silence that followed felt heavy, loaded with years of unspoken words. I was wondering when you'd ask about him, she finally said, her tone resigned. Ben leaned forward in his chair, his free hand absently stroking Rosie's fur. Please, Mom, I need to know. He heard her sigh deeply. Your father? She paused, gathering her thoughts. He always wanted to be a writer. It was all he talked about when we first met. But he never believed in himself enough. Ben's chest tightened. The parallel to his own struggles was almost too much to bear. He'd send out manuscripts, get rejected, try again, but each rejection hit him harder than the last. His mother's voice grew distant, lost in memory. One day, after particularly harsh feedback from a publisher, he just packed a bag and left. No note, no goodbye, just gone. Rosie whined softly, pressing closer to Ben's legs. Did you ever hear from him again? Ben asked, though he already knew the answer. There were rumors, his mother said. People who knew people who'd seen him working at a bookstore in Seattle, bartending in Chicago, teaching English in some small town in Montana, but they were just rumors. If he's still out there, he doesn't want to be found. Ben's free hand clenched into a fist. All these years he'd imagined his father might have had some grand reason for leaving, but the truth was simpler and more painful. Daniel Harper had simply given up. "I'm sorry, Ben," his mother said softly. "I know this isn't what you wanted to." Here, after saying goodbye, Ben set the phone down and looked at Rosie. She tilted her head at him, those intelligent eyes seeming to ask what he would do next. The frustration simmered in his chest. He wasn't just chasing his father's past anymore, he was chasing a ghost. Ben stood in Margaret's study once again, surrounded by the lingering presence of his grandmother. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through tall windows. Evelyn moved methodically through the room, opening drawers and sorting through papers. "There's so much here," she said, carefully handling each document. "Grandmother kept everything." Ben nodded, running his fingers along the spines of leather-bound books on a nearby shelf. The weight of family history pressed in around him. "Wait," Evelyn said suddenly, her voice sharp with interest. She reached deep into Margaret's writing desk, pulling out something from the back corner. "I've never seen this before." In her hands was a small wooden box, its dark wood worn smooth with age. A tiny brass lock held it shut, green with tarnish. "Should we?" Ben asked, but Evelyn was already working on the lock with a letter opener. After a few tense moments, the lock gave way with a soft click inside. Yellowed pages filled the box, carefully folded and tied with faded ribbon. Ben's hands trembled as he lifted them out. The first page made his heart stop. It wasn't just part of the manuscript. It was something far more personal. These were letters disguised as chapters of her novel, each one addressed to Daniel in Margaret's elegant handwriting. "Dear Daniel," Ben read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hope these words find you someday. I've hidden so many messages in my books, hoping you might see them." Evelyn touched his arm gently as he continued reading. Page after page revealed Margaret's deep pain and endless hope. She wrote about sleepless nights wondering where Daniel was, about checking the mail every day for word from him. Then Ben found something that made him gasp. She knew he was alive, he said, holding up a weathered postcard he sent this years ago. No message, just a postmark from Montana. The final letter in the bundle hit Ben the hardest. The paper was newer, the ink fresher. Margaret's normally steady handwriting showed signs of weakness, written near the end of her life. "If you're reading this, Daniel, know that Rosie will find you. She always knows where she belongs." Ben set the letters down carefully, his mind spinning. He looked at Rosie, who sat quietly by the door, watching him with those knowing eyes. Could she really lead him to his father? The idea seemed impossible, yet after everything he'd discovered, he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. One thing became crystal clear as he stood there surrounded by Margaret's words and memories. He had to finish her book, not just for himself, but for all of them. Margaret, Daniel, and even Rosie. Ben swept his arm across his desk, carefully gathering his scattered drafts into a neat pile. He set them aside, making room for Margaret's notes and journals. The familiar weight of failure that usually accompanied looking at his work felt different now, lighter somehow. He opened his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. For a moment he just sat there, taking in the quiet of his apartment and the steady presence of Rosie at his feet. Then he began to type. The words flowed easier than they ever had before. He didn't just copy Margaret's story, he transformed it, weaving his own experiences into the narrative she'd begun. The protagonist became a blend of himself and his father, a man haunted by self-doubt, running from his own potential, a writer who couldn't believe in himself. Ben typed, glancing down at Rosie, until an old dog showed him the way. Home days melted together as Ben wrote. He barely noticed when darkness fell or dawn broke. Rosie maintained her quiet vigil beside his chair, getting up only When he needed a break, she'd nose his hand or paw at his leg as if saying, "Keep going, the story isn't finished." Yet he wrote about loneliness and the weight of expectations, about a young man who felt crushed under the shadow of success, just as Daniel must have felt being Margaret Langley's son. He described the burning shame of giving up, of running away, feelings he knew all too well from his own failed attempts at writing, but most importantly he wrote about hope, about a dog who appeared at exactly the right moment, who seemed to understand more than any animal should, who guided lost souls back to where they belonged. The dog knew, Ben wrote, his fingers flying across the keyboard. She'd always known every person she met. Every path she took led to this moment. Rosie's head lifted at these words, her ears perking up. Ben smiled down at her, reaching to scratch behind her ears as the story's climax approached. Ben paused, his hand stilling over the keys. Something shifted in his understanding. This wasn't just Margaret's unfinished novel anymore. It wasn't even just the story of his father's disappearance. Somehow, without realizing it, he'd woven his own journey into every page, his struggles, his fears, his newfound sense of belonging. He sat back in his chair, the realization washing over him. He wasn't just the writer anymore, he was part of the story itself. Ben's life fell into a new rhythm. During the day he pored over public records and social media posts, searching for any trace of Daniel Harper. At night he lost himself in writing, weaving together Margaret's unfinished story with his own growing understanding of family and belonging. His desk became a command center of sorts. One side held Margaret's manuscript and his laptop, where the novel continued to grow. The other side was covered in printouts, old newspaper clippings, and scribbled notes about Daniel's possible whereabouts. Rosie watched it all with those knowing eyes of hers, moving between Ben's chair and the window as if keeping guard. Sometimes when Ben's frustration mounted after another dead end, she'd rest her chin on his knee until his breathing steadied. Then on a rainy Tuesday morning his phone buzzed. An email from someone named Frank Martinez appeared in his inbox. Ben's heart skipped as he read the message. "I knew your father. He used to work with me at the library about 5 years ago. Last I heard he was living near Thompson Street. There's a bookstore there." The dusty spine. He was a regular. Ben's hand shook as he grabbed his keys. The drive to Thompson Street took him through a maze of narrow roads lined with weathered buildings. The dusty spine was wedged between a laundromat and a vacant storefront, its windows clouded with dust and age. Inside, the smell of old books filled the air. A bell chimed as Ben entered, causing an elderly man to look up from behind the counter. His thick glasses magnified his eyes, giving him an owlish appearance. "Can I help you?" the man asked, marking his place in a worn paperback. Ben cleared his throat. "I'm looking for information about someone who used to come here." "Daniel Harper." The owner's expression shifted, recognition flickering across his face. "Daniel, yeah, he used to come here, read for hours." He shook his head slowly. "But he hasn't been around in a long time." "Do you know where he went?" Ben pressed, trying to keep the desperation from his voice. The man scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Last I heard he was living in an old trailer on the outskirts of town near the railroad tracks, I think. That's all I know." Ben thanked him and stumbled back to his car, where Rosie waited patiently. In the passenger seat the sky had darkened and street lights flickered to life along Thompson Street. He sat there, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Rosie shifted closer, resting her head on his lap. Her warmth was steady and reassuring against his trembling hands. "What if he doesn't want to see me?" Ben whispered into the growing darkness. The question hung heavy in the air, filled with years of absence and unspoken words. Rosie lifted her head and nudged his arm with her nose, her eyes reflecting the streetlight's glow. The gesture was gentle but insistent, like she was telling him it was time to find out. The morning sun barely penetrated the thick fog as Ben guided his car down a narrow pothholed road. Tall grass brushed against the sides of his vehicle, and twisted tree branches formed a canopy overhead. The GPS signal had died 20 minutes ago, leaving him to navigate by the bookstore owner's vague directions. Rosie sat upright in the passenger seat, more alert than Ben had ever seen her. Her ears twitched at every sound, and her eyes scanned the landscape intently. Something about her intensity made Ben's heart beat faster. The trailer park appeared through the mist like a forgotten town. Most of the homes looked abandoned, their metal sides rusted and warped by years of neglect. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth, and ancient satellite dishes hung at odd angles at the far end of the park. Partially hidden by overgrown bushes stood a silver Airstream trailer. Unlike its neighbors, this one showed signs of recent habitation. A thin wisp of smoke curled from its chimney, and a stack of firewood lay neatly arranged beside the door. Ben parked and cut the engine. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the occasional creak of settling metal. His legs felt like lead as he climbed out of the car, Rosie following close behind. The grass around the trailer reached past his knees, crackling with each step. Empty bird feeders hung from a nearby tree, swaying gently in the morning breeze. Ben approached the door, his hand trembling as he raised it to knock. The sound echoed hollowly. No response. He tried again, harder this time. The door shifted slightly under his knuckles, creaking open an inch. The interior was dark, but Ben could make out the shapes of furniture and stacks of books. Hello, he called out. Only silence answered. Taking a deep breath, Ben pushed the door open wider. The inside of the trailer was Spartan furnished but cluttered with papers and books. Every surface held reading material, dog-eared paperbacks, literary magazines, and manuscripts in various states of completion. On a small table near the window sat an unfinished manuscript, the pages covered in cramped handwriting that Ben recognized from his childhood, the same slanted script that had appeared on his birthday cards. Until he turned 7, the air felt thick with dust and the musty smell of old paper. An empty coffee cup sat on the counter, still warm to the touch. A worn denim jacket hung over the back of a wooden chair, its sleeve trailing on the floor. Ben's throat tightened. Someone had been here recently, very recently. He turned toward the door, ready to retreat and process what he'd found, when a growly voice cut through the silence like a knife. You shouldn't be here. Ben turned around. Daniel stood in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the morning light. Ben stood frozen, taking in the sight of his father. 23 years had carved deep lines into Daniel's face, and his dark hair had turned mostly gray. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, and his eyes, the same shade of brown as Ben's, looked tired and wary. Despite the changes, he was unmistakably the man from the old photographs Ben had studied so many times. The trailer's small space felt even smaller with the weight of their silence. Rosie sat perfectly still between them, her tail motionless, watching the scene unfold with those knowing eyes. Ben's throat felt dry. Words he'd rehearsed 1,000 times vanished from his mind. The morning light filtering through the dusty windows cast long shadows across the floor, making the moment feel surreal. I've been looking for you, Ben finally managed, his voice barely steady. Daniel's mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Took you long? Enough they settled at the small kitchen table, its surface scattered with papers and coffee rings. The chairs creaked under their weight. Ben could smell old books and cigarette smoke mixed with the sharp scent of black coffee. Taking a deep breath, Ben began to explain everything he told Daniel about finding Rosie at the shelter, about meeting Evelyn, about discovering Margaret's unfinished novel. As he spoke, Daniel sat motionless, his face carefully blank, giving away nothing. But when Ben mentioned the letters, Margaret's hidden messages woven into her fiction, something changed. Daniel's eyes flickered, a crack appearing in his carefully maintained facade. His fingers twitched against the table surface and his breathing became slightly uneven. Ben reached into his bag and pulled out the bundle of yellowed pages. Sliding them across the table, the paper made a soft scratching sound against the worn wood. She never gave up on you, Ben said quietly. Daniel stared at the pages as if they might burst into flames. His hands, resting on the table, slowly curled into tight fists. The muscles in his jaw worked silently. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, rough with emotion. She should have the silence stretched between them like a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. In the small trailer, Daniel's eyes darted around the room, looking anywhere but at Ben, before finally settling on his clasped hands. I couldn't. Daniel's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. I couldn't handle it anymore. Living in her shadow, trying to measure up. His words came out halting, as if each one cost him something. Every time I wrote something, I could hear her voice in my head, pointing out every flaw, every weakness. Ben watched his father's shoulders hunch forward, noticed how his fingers twisted together nervously on the table. She was Margaret Langley. Daniel continued, his voice bitter, and I was just nobody. Everything I wrote felt worthless compared to her work. The rejections kept coming, and each one felt like proof that I'd never be good enough. Rosie moved closer to Daniel, but he didn't reach out to pet her. His eyes had taken on a distant look, lost in painful memories. So I walked away from everything, told myself it was better that way. He followed hard, his jaw tightening, and when I finally realized what a mistake I'd made when I wanted to come back, his voice dropped to barely a whisper. Too much time had passed. Ben studied his father's face, seeing not the monster of his childhood imagination, but a broken man who had been hiding from his own failures for decades. This shabby trailer, these scattered manuscripts, they weren't just a home, they were a prison Daniel had built for himself. You had a son, Ben said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest, and you left me too. Daniel flinched as if he'd been struck. Guilt flashed across his face, raw and unmistakable. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Ben didn't wait for the apology that hung unspoken in the air. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor, and grabbed Margaret's manuscript from the table. She wanted you to finish this. Daniel shook his head quickly, almost desperately. That's your story now. Ben paused, looking down at the pages in his hands. The question that had been burning inside him finally spilled out. Then why did Rosie come to me? Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes meeting Ben for the first time. Because she knew I never would have the courage to come to her. The setting sun painted long shadows across the overgrown grass as Ben stepped out of the trailer. Margaret's manuscript clutched tightly against his chest. The evening air felt cooler now, gentler than the stifling atmosphere inside. Behind him he heard the creak of floorboards as Daniel moved to the doorway, but stopped there, leaning against the weathered frame. Rosie, who had been sitting quietly throughout their conversation, rose to Her nails clicked softly against the metal steps as she made her way down, but instead of following Ben to the car, she turned toward Daniel. She moved with deliberate steps until she stood just inches from him, her brown eyes fixed on his face with that same knowing look Ben had come to recognize. Daniel's hard expression cracked just slightly, the bitterness that had lined his face throughout their conversation melted away as he looked down at the dog slowly, as if moving through a dream. He crouched down to her level, his hand trembled slightly as he reached out, finally resting it on her head. "You were always the smart one, weren't you?" he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. His fingers curled into her thick fur, holding on for a moment as if she were an anchor in a storm. Rosie stayed perfectly still, allowing the touch, her tail giving just the slightest wag. When Daniel finally let go, Ben could see the effort it took for him to pull his hand away. The car door felt heavy as Ben pulled it open. He slid into the driver's seat, placing the manuscript carefully on the dashboard. Rosie padded over and jumped into the passenger side, settling into her usual spot through the windshield. Ben could see Daniel still standing in the doorway of his trailer, a solitary figure framed by the dying light. As Ben turned the key and the engine rumbled to life, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't the reunion he'd imagined all those years. There were no tearful apologies, no promises to make things right. But as he pulled away, watching Daniel's figure grow smaller in the rearview mirror, he realized that maybe this was what he really needed all along. Not a happy ending, but closure. The manuscript seemed to hum with possibility beside him for the first time since he discovered Margaret's unfinished story. Ben knew exactly how to end it. Ben sat at his desk, the soft glow of his computer screen illuminating the scattered pages of Margaret's manuscript. His finger traced the faded ink of her handwriting, feeling the slight indentations where her pen had pressed into the paper. The weight of responsibility settled over him like a familiar blanket. Rosie lay in her usual spot beside his desk, her chin resting on her paws, watching him with those patient, knowing eyes. The cursor blinked steadily on the screen, waiting. Ben took a deep breath and began to type. Margaret words flowed into his own like two streams joining to form a river. Slipped by unnoticed as he wrote, pausing only when his coffee grew cold or when Rosie nudged his hand for an occasional pat. The story took shape under his fingers. He wrote about a man who carried anger like armor, protecting himself from the pain of abandonment. But through the quiet wisdom of an old dog, the man learned that holding on to resentment was like carrying stones in his pockets. It only weighed him down. Ben poured his own journey into the pages. The dog in the story became more than just a companion. She was the thread that stitched together torn pieces of a family's history. She padded silently between past and present, leading characters toward understanding, just as Rosie had led him to Daniel. In the final chapter, Ben wrote about forgiveness, not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that helps you move forward despite it. He wrote about a father and son who couldn't bridge their gap completely, but found peace in accepting what was instead of what could have been. The last sentence appeared on the screen almost of its own accord. Ben's fingers stilled on the keyboard, and he let out a long breath that felt like he'd been holding it for years. It was an exhaustion that made his shoulders sag, but relief pure and simple. He looked down at Rosie, who hadn't moved from her spot throughout his writing marathon. "We did it," he said softly. Her tail thumped against the floor in a slow, steady rhythm, her wise old eyes twinkling in the dim light. Ben's hands shook slightly as he attached the manuscript file to the email he double-checked Evelyn's address, took a deep breath and clicked send. The familiar whoosh sound felt different this time. Weightier, more significant. Rosie pressed against his leg, her warm presence steadying him. The next morning his phone rang. Evelyn's voice came through thick with emotion. "Ben, I just finished reading it," she said, pausing to collect herself. "It's beautiful the way you were." Her words, "With yours my grandma-mother would be proud." Ben's throat tightened. He reached down to scratch Rosie's ears, unable to find the right words to respond. Over the next few days Evelyn worked her connections in the publishing world. She took the manuscript to Riverside Publishing, the same company that had rejected Ben's previous work just months ago. This time was different. The moment Margaret Langley's name appeared on the cover page, the editor's eyes lit up with interest. Ben tried not to get his hopes up. He'd been here before, waiting for responses that always ended in rejection. He busied himself with his daily routine, walking Rosie, making coffee, staring at blank documents on his computer screen. Then the email arrived. The subject line read, "Manuscript Acceptance, Riverside Publishing." Ben's heart stopped. He read the first line 3 times to make sure he wasn't imagining it. "We are pleased to inform you that we would like to publish your novel." They wanted to release it under both names, Margaret Langley and Ben Harper, a collaboration across time. They called it a story that began in Margaret's imagination but found its completion through Ben's journey. His hands trembling, Ben hit print on the email, the printer word to life, spitting out the single page that represented everything he'd been working toward. He placed it carefully on his desk, smoothing out the corners. Rosie patted over her nose, gently touching the paper before she settled down beside his chair. Ben ran his fingers through her, for his voice barely above a whisper. "I finally did it, girl." For the first time since he could remember, he felt like a real writer. The bookstore window displayed Rosie's last story, prominently Margaret Langley's name above BS in elegant gold lettering. Inside copies were stacked high on tables, their covers showing a silhouette of a German shepherd against a sunset. Ben stood back, taking it all in. After months of editing, marketing meetings, and nervous anticipation, the book was finally here. Reviews began appearing in literary magazines and online blogs, a touching exploration of family forgiveness and the bonds that guide us home, wrote one critic. Langley's final work, completed by her grandson, speaks to anyone who's ever felt lost, said another. The story resonated with readers in ways Ben hadn't expected. Social media buzzed with photos of people reading the book, often with their own dogs curled up beside them. Messages flooded his inbox, stories of estranged families finding their way back together, of second chances seized, of healing old wounds at his first book signing. Ben's hands were sweaty as he arranged his pens on the table. The line stretched through the bookstore and out the door. Rosie lay at his feet, calmer than he was, watching each person approach with those knowing eyes. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, clutching the book to her chest. Her eyes were bright with emotion as she placed it on the table. "This book," she said, her voice catching, "it felt like it was written just for me, like you somehow knew exactly what I needed to hear." Ben looked up at her, seeing the impact of his words reflected in her face. It wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who found pieces of themselves in its pages. Person after person shared similar sentiments. Some spoke of reconnecting with parents they hadn't spoken to in years. Others talked about finding the courage to chase dreams they'd abandoned. Each story touched Ben deeply, reminding him how far he'd come from those days of rejection letters and self-doubt. When the signing ended, Ben Drove home with Rosie in the passenger seat just as they'd done so many times before. She moved more slowly now, her muzzle grayer, but her eyes still held that same wisdom that had first drawn him to her. At the shelter in his apartment, Ben carefully placed a signed copy of Rosie's last story on his shelf. He sat on the floor beside it, and Rosie settled next to him, resting her head on his lap as he stroked her soft fur. Gratitude washed over him. This faithful companion had left him not just to a book deal, but to his family's history, to understanding, and finally to himself. The morning dawned cold and gray, seeping through Ben's apartment windows. He stretched and rolled over, expecting Rosie's usual gentle nudge for breakfast. But the silence felt different today. Heavy. Wrong. His eyes fell on Rosie's familiar shape curled up in her spot beside his bed. She hadn't moved. His heart stumbled in his chest as he slid out of bed and knelt beside her. "Hey girl," he whispered, his hand trembling as he reached out to stroke her fur. "Time to get up." She didn't lift her head. Ben's throat tightened as he gently shook her. Rosie's eyes opened slightly, those wise brown eyes that had guided him through so much, and fixed on his face one last time. The look in them was peaceful but distant, as if she were already seeing something far beyond the room. Ben gathered her in his arms, tears blurring his vision as he rushed to the emergency vet clinic. But deep down he already knew the gentle way she'd watched him the night before, how she'd pressed closer than usual when he read through his fan mail. She'd known too. The vet's examination was brief, her face compassionate as she confirmed what Ben's heart had already told him. Rosie's time had come. Her body was shutting down, her long journey finally coming to an end. Ben sat on the floor of the examination room, cradling Rosie in his arms. Her breathing was shallow now, but her eyes never left his face. He thought of everything she'd given him, his career, his family history, his sense of purpose. This extraordinary dude who had chosen him that day at the shelter, knowing exactly what he needed before he did. "You found me, girl," he whispered, his tears falling into her soft fur. "You gave me everything." Rosie's tail thumped weakly against his leg one last time, then with a soft sigh she took her final breath, her body growing still in his arms. Later that afternoon, Ben stood under a towering oak tree on Margaret's estate, where the ground was soft and dappled with autumn sunlight. It seemed right that Rosie should rest here, close to where her journey had begun. Evelyn stood beside him, her own eyes bright with tears as they looked down at the fresh grave. "She did what she was meant to do," Evelyn said, softly placing a hand on Ben's shoulder. Ben knelt and carefully placed a copy of Rosie's last story next to the small stone marker place. Lisa was already reaching for the adoption papers, a knowing smile on her face as Ben filled out the forms. The lab pressed against the kennel door, watching his every move with leash in hand. Ben led his new companion toward the shelter exit. He paused at the doorway, looking down at the dog who was about to change his life once again. "Come on, girl," he whispered, "let's start a new story." Ben stood at the podium in the crowded bookstore, his new dog Luna sitting calmly at his feet. The familiar scent of coffee and new books filled the air as eager readers packed the aisles, some even standing in the back. His latest book, The Dog Who Knew, lay displayed on tables throughout the store. A year ago, he began, his voice steady and warm. "I was a failed writer who could barely pay his bills. Then I met a German shepherd named Rosie who changed everything." The crowd leaned in, drawn to the authenticity in his voice. Luna's tail thumped against the floor as B shared their story. He told them about Margaret Langley's unfinished manuscript, about finding his father, about how one dog had pieced together a broken family. The words flowed naturally now. He'd found his voice. Sometimes he continued, our greatest guides come with 4 legs and tail. Soft laughter rippled through the audience, followed by knowing nods as the signing session began. A woman with graying hair approached his table. Her hands trembled slightly as she held out his book. Tears glistened in her eyes. I lost my Sophie last year, she said softly, a golden retriever we had 15 years together. She paused, collecting herself. Your book, it helped me understand that it's okay to grieve, but also to remember the joy. Ben took her book gently. What was Sophie like? The woman's face brightened as she shared memories of her beloved dog. Ben listened, nodding before signing her copy with care. Later that evening, Ben drove to Margaret's estate. Luna sitting in the passenger seat where Rosie once had. The setting sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks as they walked to the quiet spot under the old tree. Rosie's grave looked peaceful, the small plaque catching the last rays of sunlight. Ben sat down in the cool grass, Luna settling beside him. He pulled out a copy of his new book, running his fingers over the cover. The gentle breeze rustled through the pages. As he sat there, remembering, Luna rested her head on his lap, offering quiet comfort. The sadness that had once overwhelmed him had transformed into something different, a deep gratitude for what Rosie had given him. You were right, Rosie, he murmured to the quiet evening air. You always knew. The wind whispered through the leaves above, and Ben felt that familiar presence, as if Rosie was still there, guiding him forward just as she always had. If you enjoyed the story of Ben and Rosie, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.